Welcome to MINIG7 Part2, Governance Structures and the Need for Coherence in National Acts is very prevalent on the African continent. So on this slide, you can see all the slides that show red color and black. Those are areas that show conflict and fragile democracies. Therefore, the African continent still has very young democracies which are not yet very strong. We discussed about the EIT. Okay, so the EIT looks at the transparency index status of different countries. So this transparent index is very important in the management of resources because it shows the citizens where the money from the mining sector is going. Okay, and so we can see here that the compliant countries are given on this list: Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Ghana, Liberia, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, Congo, Zambia, and Tanzania. And those ones outside Africa are given here. Okay. Then we have countries which have applied to be part of the EIT process. From Africa, we have Cameroon, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, DRC, Guinea, Sao Tome and Togo, and these ones from outside the continent. And then the countries which are intending to implement, we've got Cameroon, and countries which have been suspended from the EIT, Madagascar, Mauritania, Sierra Leone, and countries which have lost their status, Equatorial Guinea and Gabon. Okay. Investment indicator for Sub-Saharan Africa. We saw this slide before, with deficient infrastructure, political risk, limited domestic market, limited availability of skilled labor, and other factors such as poor education, poor infrastructures, and so forth. So the judge's opinion is rarely respected in these African countries. Politicians have got more power than the judges. Politicians appoint the most powerful captains of state enterprises who they share issues with. These captains of industries, they go along with what the politicians look, which makes the democracy to be very, very fragile on the African continent. The challenges that African governments face are global competitiveness. Africa is host to 15 out of 20 of the world's least economically developed countries. So out of the whole world, 15 countries, very poor countries, are in Africa. Okay, high levels of corruption, inefficiency, low levels of education, and also corruption. They make business very expensive on the African continent. And the other thing we look at, the democratic nations are doing much better on the African continent than those which are not democratic. Okay, authoritarian regimes and have got weak human rights mechanisms. Okay, Africa has not come together as a bloc to embrace a common human rights code by which all its members are going to follow. The ICC has been accused of being biased when dealing with African countries. The question, though, is why should African countries appear before the ICC if all is good and well? Okay, for example, the Southern African Development Community, they killed their tribunal, which was based in Windhoek. So which means that there can be no intra-country justice anymore. But we should also say that there are some interesting things happening in Africa. Just this week, the Justice Minister of the Gambia took Myanmar to the International Court to challenge them on the issues of genocide. So we can see that African countries are beginning to bring these issues on the global scale as well, which is a good sign. Okay, press freedom is another problem on the continent. In the last 12 years, press freedom has declined on the continent. Okay, for example, in 2015, 48 African journalists were in prisons across Southern Africa, and 152 were forced into exile. Okay, some newspapers were closed. This is more than any other region in the world. Only 3% of the Africans live in a country with a free press. This is a very small number. Okay, these situations do not favor direct foreign investment in African countries. Corruption and lack of transparency. So it's a very big challenge. So nearly everybody knows about corruption in Africa. Business governance has steadily improved in Africa, but corruption is still a big problem. It needs to be transparent so that it can go down. Ordinary Africans who are obliged to pay illegal charges for children, health, or marketing of goods makes business very expensive. Investors, they see corruption as raising the cost of doing business. And so this makes it very difficult for the African continent to actually compete on a global scale because we've got these issues of competitiveness. Okay, tax evasion. Okay, there's a lot of tax evasion on the African continent, which threatens African governments. Okay, for example, in the Panama Papers, we saw that high levels of intra-company trade create extensive scope for trade mispricing, enabling companies to report profits in low tax jurisdictions, and the extensive use of offshore companies and shell companies make it difficult for African tax authorities to assess profits and enforce compliance. So there's still a lot of big companies on the African continent who are actually taking their money outside the continent. In Africa alone, trade mispricing, it costs the African continent 38 billion between 2008 and 2010. So this is more than what the region received in bilateral aid from the donors. If you put this differently, what it means is that Africa can do without aid by eliminating unfair pricing practices and unfair trade practices by different companies. And most of these companies are actually mining companies. So that last slide can be seen here in terms of a diagram. We saw it before, so that we send out money out of the African continent more than we receive from outside. So there's been some changes on the African continent. After independence, most countries became one-man dictatorships, but now this has changed greatly. From the 1990s, democracy was impressed, and most countries now in Africa are democratic. However, these democracies have very weak democratic institutions, and constitutions keep changing, and that is not good, very good. While multi-party democracy opens the path for greater participation in the political discourse, the same is not true in the economic arena. Of the African countries, post-1990, Ghana appears to have carved a wonderful path of multi-party politics with ease in the changes of governments. Should we look for a success economic story in Ghana? Maybe yes. So it's Ghana, which has been able to change political parties without any problems of violence or unrest. We need this to happen across the whole African continent. The African Mining Vision is a very good piece that the African Union has come up with, because it has outlined most of these failures, and the African Mining Vision has come up with incentives for the African mining industries that are not well linked with the local economy. Somehow, similar to the tourism industry, where the players are big hotels and foreign car hire companies in accord with foreign tour companies. The locals are not involved in the economy. So the African Mining Vision would like to turn this around to have local participation, local content participation. Money is paid for hotels and cars and food, and this money goes back to the investors without staying in the countries where the investment is. The African Mining Vision has told us that this is a very good window of opportunity, which should allow countries to formulate policies that can make them gain from their mineral resources, and will make those policies that will catalyze growth and poverty alleviation across the continent. The African Mining Vision proposes that the existing natural resource laws and regulations be reviewed to better accommodate the interests of African people. So governments are now supposed to take that lead so that they can actually benefit the local people. So the African Mining Vision is aiming at Africa to become a big powerhouse of mineral resource development, rather than just a player which is not not even benefiting from its mineral resources. Unlike policies that primarily focus on better ways to tax large companies, the African mining vision would like mining companies to actually invest in a different way, rather than just taxation. In contrast to an enclave mineral economy, the African mining vision articulates a mining policy in terms of development corridors, clusters of industrialization, and sharing of infrastructure. And one of the things the African mining vision is bringing out is that local companies must craft community development agreements with the local populations. We're going to deal with this one in lecture number 8 and 9 separately. Okay? So the African mining vision would like a transparent, equitable, and optimal mineral resource industry on the continent, which is knowledge-driven. Okay? And African market through downstream linkages into mineral beneficiation and manufacturing. We discussed this before. Upstream linkages into mining capital goods, consumables, and service industries. Sidestream linkages into infrastructure, power logistics, communications, water, and skills. Mutually beneficial partnership between the state and the private sector, civil society, and local communities. For example, when we bring power to a mine, we should not only bring it to a mine, but also bring it to the local community so that they can also benefit from the power aspect. Comprehensive knowledge of this mineral endowment, which currently is actually better known by people who are not in those countries. So in terms of governance, the mining law is the principal regulatory instrument governing mineral exploitation activities, and it defines both the rights and obligations of the mining title holder and the power of government officers. The government's first role is to regulate the industry at all levels, including domestic exploration, exploitation, extraction, as well as primary mineral processing. So governments must put policies that have mineral processing as a requirement. However, many mining companies look at these mining laws and the associated implementation of these rules and regulations, okay, in such a way that the state, that the holder of the exploration or mining license must comply with all other provisions and include a number of environmental provisions. So mining companies must take this into account. Governments must see that this works. Mining law must make common sense in terms of a business. A mine should be a business so that it can create wealth, but at the same time, it should benefit the local citizens. We discussed environment and mine closure. While mining laws are rarely specific enough to allow for broad environmental programs, many now incorporate the requirement for one or all of the following: an environmental impact assessment statement, an environmental management plan, how the mine is going to manage the environment throughout the program, a rehabilitation program during mining, and a rehabilitation program after mining, which should include a restoration fund. And the government must create policies that will allow mines to create this restoration fund, which should be looked after by a trust. Mining versus environmental laws. What is it that we need to avoid? There's a growing trend for countries to draft specific environmental regulations for the mining industry. However, this often creates conflict between the mining and the environment ministries or departments regarding which one should be responsible for their implementation. These separations must be clear and should be harmonized. Therefore, the Ministry of Mines and the Ministry of Environment should sit together and come up with policies that actually manage the mining industry as far as the environment is concerned. The laws on decommissioning are not many across the African continent, and these should be implemented. They should be crafted and implemented. Okay, a stipulation that brings about decommissioning plan or closure program. It must be outlined early on in the project planning, and many environmental clauses contained in it should be such that the mining law should overlap with the environmental legislation. Okay? And then it should be generic to all activities and contain a more precise description of the requirements. There are other laws that should be crafted which should be related to mining. One of them is the Water Resources Law. Usually this one covers both surface and groundwater, but does not include sea or ocean water. This law is aimed at regulating the uptake or usage of water or discharge of effluent to natural water courses. Water quality criteria or standards are often established under this law, and this law must be crafted together in harmony with the mining law. So the water law and the mining law must always be saying the same thing. Okay? There's also the laws on hazardous substances, especially in terms of uranium, terms of hydrocarbons, in terms of cyanide, and in terms of the forest. So these laws should be crafted in such a way that they can be implemented to preserve national parks and special areas. Okay. Then the other is the land law. The land law deals with the acquisition, disposal, use of the land, protection of the land, and management of state-owned land. So this law should always be harmonized with the mining law. The conservation law also must be very clear what happens to the environment if mining is to take place in a national park, for example. Legislation must include the protection and preservation of fauna and flora. The air quality law should look at the types of emissions that are allowed and the standards that should be adhered to by the mining companies. The government must have instruments for implementation. There is no point in making laws without having a way of implementing them. Prescriptive legislation can be costly to implement. It also requires an appropriately trained enforcement team, extensive and regular monitoring of operations, analytical and data evaluation support, an effective judicial system to administer fines and penalties. In fact, some governments actually have a special court for environmental and mining laws. Government authorities are now using a variety of other regulatory approaches to overcome these limitations. However, none of these alternatives used alone is able to address all situations. Therefore, in crafting of mining law, it is very important to see that they are all harmonized so that they can have the same language and have the same implementation strategies. So, in practice, a mixture of regulatory instruments is now advocated in order to provide the most suitable response to national needs. Performance targets, economic instruments, negotiated or voluntary agreements, and environmental management systems. These must be also be present. Post-mine closure, financial surety. There should be a law that exactly stipulates what happens when a mine closes and where the money will come from to clean up the environment. The choice of financial surety instrument is important. There are a number of options available. One, we can have an irrevocable letter of credit where an agreement between the company and the bank that the bank is going to provide cash funds to the authorities if the company defaults. We can have a performance bond. Performance bond is a surety bond which is issued by an insurance company in which the insurer is responsible for all claims up to an agreed amount. And we can have a trust fund, a fund that operates in a similar fashion to a pension fund with regular contributions being invested by the fund manager. At the end of the mine, this trust fund is used to clean up the environment. Or an insurance policy, which is a special form of performance bond. So the company takes an insurance policy for a certain amount of money. That amount of money will be used to clean up the environment and to ensure that after the mining has come to an end, everything is in good order. Our last slide looks at this financial surety post-mine closure. Once the mine has been closed, the parent company, which was mining, must guarantee, to the government that they are going to clean up the environment and that they have sufficient funds to do that. They can use that from their assets, the company's assets are pledged to the government, and also the timing of the requirement for a financial surety. So a financial surety should be established early in the life cycle of the mining project and should be reviewed on a regular basis. This ensures in fact, that once the mining has closed, they do not leave a ghost town, they do not leave a big hole which is not rehabilitated, but everything is done nicely so that the place can be environmentally friendly again. Thank you very much. We will meet again in our next lecture 8.